Hello and welcome to Zilog and Moto. I'm your host Dave, and this is your weekly look at the English language libraries of the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. If this is your first visit to the channel, I'm glad you're here, and I hope you enjoy the next 20 minutes or so as I do a deep dive into this week's game. And to all returning viewers and subscribers, thank you for coming back, as either I'm doing something right, or this channel is just a total car wreck and you can't help but watch. Either option is most definitely possible. Today's game is one that, while I've technically never played the Genesis version before covering it this week, I have apparently played it before, just under a different name. Confused yet? Let me try to explain. Growing up, we didn't have a lot of money, so I didn't have a DOS-based PC, and I certainly didn't have a Macintosh, which at that point I assumed only existed in school libraries, as I certainly didn't know anyone that owned one. But what I did have was a trusty Commodore 64 that I had inherited from my uncles, as they had moved on to more advanced gaming consoles and computers and had no longer a need for it. So I gladly took it off their hands and started to plow through all the various random pieces of software that they had with it, with some being proper store-bought packages, and then of course tons of floppies of questionable origin that may or may not have been labeled with what was actually on the disk. Unfortunately, I don't have any of that stuff anymore. I had to sell it on eBay about 20 years ago, which is a shame because I could really use that Enchanter trilogy to fill out my Infocom collection right now. Oh well, I guess I'll pick those up again at some point. Anyway, on one of those floppies in question was a game that I found very interesting at the time, and it was something called Pinball Construction Set. And it was memorable to me because it, along with Archon and One-on-One Dr. J vs. Larry Bird, was my first introduction into electronic arts. You gotta remember, this was back before FIFA, before Lakers vs. Celtics, before John Madden football, and electronic arts was a very different company, and it wasn't a given that everyone should know who they were. Pinball Construction Set isn't your typical video game, as you can probably tell by the name. Instead, I would say it's more similar to modern sim games, say something like Roller Coaster Tycoon, where given the tools in the game engine, you can create your own pinball table that can then be shared with other people. Being young at the time and lacking any kind of manual, I'm sure I didn't get everything there was to get out of Pinball Construction Set, but it did provide a fun pinball experience for the Commodore that served as a diversion when I wasn't just playing David's Midnight Magic. And yes, that title was very confusing to me as a kid, like who was that other David and why was it different than the Atari 2600 version that was just Midnight Magic? Anyway, back to Pinball Construction Set. While this video isn't about that title, what it is about is a game called Virtual Pinball, released by Electronic Arts for the Genesis in late 1993. And while it's not necessarily accurate to say that Virtual Pinball is just the Genesis version of Pinball Construction Set, the games are definitely related, as they both allow for the creation of your own pinball tables, and both titles are from the mind of a programmer named Bill Budge. So Virtual Pinball can definitely be considered a spiritual successor to Pinball Construction Set. So what exactly do we have here, as this clearly is not a 80s 8-bit home-bit computer title? Well, we shall see, but first a look at the package.
Okay, and this is my copy of Virtual Pinball for the Genesis. This copy is in decent shape. It's not perfect, as you can quickly see some wear to the corners and the spine, but other than that, it's pretty clean on the front and back, and the inner cover is fully intact, with no sun bleaching or water damage. One of the reasons that I'm postulating that this particular copy has corner damage is because it's in one of Electronic Arts' wide clamshell cases. The wide case was more common to see on EA Sports titles, but there are definitely more than a few non-sports Electronic Arts games that use them as well, They just tended to be ones that flew more under the radar, like Galahad or Technoclash. And like the thinner EA clamshells, these titles never had built-in hang tabs, so you don't have to worry about that with these titles. As far as the cover goes, I like it. There's no specific formatting that it's trying to adhere to, it's just some artwork showing an action sequence followed up by the name, with a pretty straightforward layout. I like the art, it's eye-catching and has that Tron-ish, pre-Matrix style virtual 3D look melding with pinball elements, which goes well with a name like Virtual Pinball. I think I technically prefer the European cover, which features the same artwork and a similar logo, but the artwork is slightly enlarged and more of a focus, whereas the US cover was insistent that you design your own game in the Ultimate Pinball Arcade, which was shown on not just the front, but the spine as well, in a questionable design choice. I do like that Bill Budge was mentioned on the US cover though, albeit in small print, as he's not mentioned anywhere on the European box art. One final note, this yellow diamond with a blurb from EGM, this is actually a sticker on the insert, so I guess they were a little late to the party with that one, but EA still wanted it on the cover for sales purposes. Flipping over the back, and it wasn't just EGM with praise for the title, there's quotes here from Megaplay, which honestly is the same thing as EGM, so kind of surprised that they separated it like that, and then also a quote from EGM's prime competitor at the time, GamePro, with both supposedly taking a shine to the title. However, in full disclosure, neither EGM or Megaplay actually reviewed the game, while GamePro gave it a 4 out of 5, which is a little bit dubious considering GamePro is mentioned in both the manual and has a level included in the game, so take that with a giant grain of salt. Other than the ad blurbs though, I do like the layout on the back, although it probably could have just been one screenshot of the menus, thanks. The key to the rear cover though is this red box here, which has bullet points for all the really important stuff for the game, and lists some nice features, like the ability to save 10 different created tables, and that it comes with 29 pre-built tables, which is huge from an actual game perspective. But check out this piece, 6 games by a top arcade pinball designer. Opening up the package, and the manual is in good shape with a slight bend, and the warranty card, which is nice. But I've got to check on that top designer. Let's flip to the back and look at the credits. Okay, apparently that designer is listed as the incredible mystery pinball guru genius. Okay, let's move on. The rest of the manual, I suppose it does its job. It's a little on the lean side though. This is a game that really could have used the old school EA manual that was perhaps too thick rather than being too thin. I do like, however, though, if you flip over to the back, the rear cover effectively acts as a quick start sheet, which is nice, but definitely odd placement. I'm not sure how many people are going to look at the back of the manual. Okay, that's the package for Virtual Pinball. Let's get into it and create some tables? I don't know, we'll see how this goes. Before I get too into Virtual Pinball, I do want to talk a little more about its heritage and linking the game back to Pinball Construction Set. I mentioned that the original Pinball Construction Set was the brainchild of a programmer named Bill Budge, who had previously done some work for the Apple II, including a video pinball game called Raster Blaster. Raster Blaster was somewhat of a hit, possibly in part due to unofficially copying Williams' Firepower table. And I'll admit, when I first heard that, it seemed a bit unlikely, but I checked, and sure enough, both Firepower and Raster Blaster have similar table layouts. However, the thing to know about Bill... that sounds too informal. The thing to know about Mr. Budge is that he doesn't really consider himself a gamer, and he doesn't enjoy playing the games that he's had a hand in working on, instead preferring to just work in the background on other coding or game engine tools. And that checks out because if you look at his resume, he didn't work directly on another game in the 10 years between Pinball Construction Set and Virtual Pinball. Beyond that, neither Pinball Construction Set or Virtual Pinball are really games, as their strength is more in what you can create with them versus actual gameplay, which is fitting based on Mr. Budge's career of creating the tools that programmers use to create video games versus the video games themselves. But that's all probably getting ahead of things. Let's back up for a second and look deeper at Virtual Pinball. Just based on its name alone, you wouldn't necessarily know that Virtual Pinball is designed to be a creation utility rather than just a game. And I'm sure there's a few reasons for that. For instance, I'm willing to bet that Electronic Arts had doubts about the ability to sell a video pinball creation tool on a console rather than a PC to kids. The solution? Make it appear to be, at least partially, an actual video pinball title. This is where the marketing on the back of the box comes in, with Electronic Arts boasting of 29 pre-made pinball games, including those mysterious 6 designed by some designer of actual physical pinball machines. And truth be told, if you want to just pick up and play pinball with a virtual pinball, you can. Although, to be honest, there's some caveats to that 29 number. The first issue is that of those 29, not all of them are unlocked and available for play right away. When you boot up the game, there will be 18 populated pinball tables available, along with 4 blueprint tables that can be used as templates to create your own, and then of course 10 available save slots that can be used for your own table creations. So, what gives, as even the average second grader can tell you that 18 is less than 29? Well, there's a few things going on here. The first is the existence of unlockable tables, with there actually being an additional 16 tables that can be played, assuming you know the password, which in this case is the name of the table itself. I guess it's a Mr. Mixelplick thing, I don't know. At least some, if not all, of these tables are achieved by unlocking them via playing some of the regular tables, and you'll need to write those table names down because even though the game features battery backup for the purposes of high scores and table creation, it doesn't save your progress in the tables that you've unlocked, which seems like an oversight. I mean, the battery is sitting right there, they couldn't have it track that as well? Adding 16 to the base 18 gets you 34 tables, so technically Electronic Arts over-delivered if you count all the tables, right? If only it were that easy. I mean, if you're going to be technical, yes, there are 34 named tables to play, not including the blueprints and your save tables. However, of those 34, there are 6 puzzle tables. The puzzle tables, as you might have assumed, aren't your standard pinball table, and instead rely on getting the ball to specific locations using gimmicky setups, like having 100 flippers to navigate through, or a track where you have to control the direction of bumpers to pass. I've got to be honest, I didn't like these tables at all. They feel like more of a proof of concept thing than anything else, and I would think that most people would probably play them once to get through them, and then never again. Most of the puzzle tables are relatively straightforward about what you do to unlock the next table in the series, but then there's also 2 other tables, Compulsion and Your Break, that are used to unlock more standard tables for play. The problem is, nowhere are you told what you need to do to unlock those tables, much less any of the further tables in that ladder. Now, I fully support having unlockables in a game that need to be accessed by completing certain tasks, and I definitely support that rather than paid DLC unlocks, which seem to be the majority of unlocks these days. However, I feel like there should have at least been some sort of hint given somewhere that tells you what you need to do. I'm fine with having to bang my head against the wall for a while to hit the right target, but damn, at least tell me which wall is going to cause my brain damage. Now that we've established what tables are included in the box, how well did they actually play, seeing as how they could have included 100 tables, but if they all sucked, it wouldn't matter. Well, this is where I think we kind of get into Bill Budge being a tool designer rather than a game designer. The first issue is what I'm going to call the crew ball problem. If you're a longtime viewer of the channel, or just were around back in the day, you may know that Virtual Pinball isn't Electronic Arts' first pinball game on the Genesis, as that was actually a game called Crew Ball, based around heavy metal act Motley Crue. And in fact, the reason why I'm reviewing Virtual Pinball now is because I'm unofficially grouping these 2 games into a series, and it's been 100 episodes since I looked at Crew Ball. Anyway, the whole point is, as much as I enjoyed Crew Ball, it had an odd gameplay element where you get 4 balls for your playthrough. The reason why I say this is odd is because standard pinball machines almost always are set to either have 5 balls for the old electromagnetic setups from the 60s and 70s, or 3 balls if you're playing something from the more modern solid state era. But 4 balls is just weird. I mean, I'm sure that maybe there's some table out there that's set up like that, like perhaps the Monday Night Football machine with each ball representing a quarter of the game, but it's definitely not normal. And I would think that had Mr. Budge actually been a gamer, This is probably something that either would have been fixed or made an option along with all the other customization options. Very bizarre that both Electronic Arts pinball games have this setup, and almost make me wonder if perhaps there was some crew ball code that got reused here. Another issue is the shape of the play surface. Have you ever played a pinball machine that was square? No? Well, me either. But for some reason, the designers apparently went with a 512 by 512 pixel grid, and the result is a bunch of tables that play like they're actually two pinball machines side by side, and that they're only marginally connected. I mean, I suppose it's fine, and of course when you're building your own, you don't have to use all that space, but had the designers been actual gamers, I would think that you would have seen a layout that was more like 640 by 224, or something perhaps even taller. Dimensions and rule issues aside, physically, Virtual Pinball plays well, and I don't really have any complaints, other than I did get a few balls stuck, which I guess makes it somewhat realistic, I suppose, and I did get locked in a few infinite loops, which of course is the opposite. The way the game handles multi-balls is a little weird, with one ball always being your primary, but with the way the screen has to scroll to handle the playfield, makes that a bit of a necessary evil, so I suppose I'm just glad they included multi-balls at all. Also, Virtual Pinball has 3 options for physics and ball speed, which is nice and helps to balance out the action, especially depending on the table layout. That actually leads me to the table creation portion of the game, which is twofold. First, for any of the existing tables, you can alter the previously mentioned physics settings, but then you can also change the table background, part theme, and music. Enjoy the layout of a table like Bloodbath, but want to make it a little less spooky? Well, just change the part theme to something besides gore, and the game will swap out the look. I really enjoy this flexibility to edit the existing games because even if you don't want to spend all the time designing a table from scratch, you can still mix things up pretty easily just with a few setting changes. As far as the table editor goes, for console, I think it's fine. I think I would have liked to have seen some more variety of the parts, but of course they were limited in how many they could put into the game, since every parts theme had to have its own representation of each piece. In just 30 minutes of messing around, I was able to get a fully functional table together, and that was totally from scratch and not using any of the existing tables as a blueprint. So I'm sure if someone was so inclined, they could spend hours creating and testing their own setups. As far as the graphics and sound in-game go, I think they're decent. Just due to the nature, the graphics are slightly vanilla, but I do like how each of the parts themes are very different, and clearly the designers put effort into not having them each look like they were just a clone of one another, with slightly different colors. A table using the gore theme is going to look wildly different than a table using the droid theme. Also, I like how each of the themes not only control the look of the table, but also the sound of the table, with each having sound effects that change based on the theme. I'm sure they could have just had the same generic effects for each theme, but if you've ever played a real pinball machine in a location where you can actually hear the machine, the sound design is actually pretty important to the feel of playing the game, so in that regard, the custom effects are a nice win. The music, on the other hand, is just kind of okay. I wouldn't call any of the background tracks bad necessarily, and with the game coming out in late 1993, I think they had the technical aspects of getting music imported down, so the music sounds fine quality-wise. For instance, if you just listen to the music, you can kind of visualize someone playing the tracks on a synthesizer. However, none of the tracks really grab me to the point of, oh, I really want to use that one when I play, which is kind of par for the course for the rest of the game. To sum up, I know I spent a lot of time previously complaining about seemingly little things, about too many or too few balls, the shape of the playfield, and how many tables are actually included in the game. But I've been trying to make a point about how details like that make it seem like the designers might be great at creating programming tools, but they don't seem to have a good feel for what constitutes a proper pinball title. And sure, I understand that the whole point of something like Virtual Pinball is that the players can do whatever they want and aren't constrained to real-world limitations. But at the same time, I think not being cognizant of little details like that are just emblematic of a game that doesn't really seem to know what it wants. Rating Virtual Pinball is a bit tricky, since it's only half a traditional game. Personally, I think it's fine for what it is, and I didn't have any problem spending a few hours with it for the review, and I certainly could have played it for longer if I wanted to do things like try to set all the high scores, etc. But honestly, one of the things that really makes pinball games work is that the custom themes that they have. Say something like Crew Ball, or the Crush games, or even Sonic Spinball, as much as I hate to mention that one. They all have a very unique feel and things that you're trying to accomplish. Anything created in Virtual Pinball, while it can be mildly amusing at times, just feels sterile and generic. Personally, I don't see myself ever playing this again. There's simply better options out there for video pinball, and for that reason, I'm going to give it 2 stars. But, and this is a big caveat, if you enjoy being able to create your own game environment, a la something like SimCity, and the idea of doing that for pinball sounds fun, you would want to consider this at least a 3-star title, as it does a solid job of that, especially for the 16-bit era.
And that was Virtual Pinball for the Genesis. After playing the game this week, I think I might have ended up with more questions than answers. Like, why did EA decide to make a console-based follow-up to Pinball Construction Set, rather than a PC-based one? Why drag Bill Budge back into game design after he had been gone for 10 years? The only thing I can come up with is that EA saw the success that they had the previous year with Crew Ball, and they wanted to run that back again with another pinball title around Christmas. So they decided to simply build on what they already had, since Crew Ball technically came from a third party originally. I'd definitely be interested in some of the conversations that led to the creation of Virtual Pinball, but as it stands, it's definitely a unique title in the Genesis library. Next week on Zilog and Moto, I actually don't have anything picked out yet, but I'm leaning towards something on the Sega CD to break up the recent string of Genesis reviews and hopefully 2-star reviews as well. Also, the video might be delayed a little bit, but I haven't closed up shop for the season yet, and I'm hoping to get at least 2 more reviews on the schedule before the end of the year wrap-up show for Season 4. We'll see what I can come up with. Well, that is it for Zilog and episode 179. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos and hopefully get interested in the channel. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.